Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion. CPP's Inclusive Growth Network is delighted to be hosting this special In Conversation with Andy Haldane. Andy is, as you know, former chief economist at the Bank of England. He then went into Boris Johnson's government to lead on the development of the Levelling Up White Paper, and is now chief executive of the RSA, one of our partners of the Inclusive Growth Network. For more information on the IGN and CPP, please click on any of the links in our chat bar or go to the website progressive-policy.net. Before we begin, a quick note to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available to watch back on our website at your convenience. We're also webcasting this session via YouTube and Twitter, so please tweet or post comments and questions using the Twitter handles @CenterProPolicy or @IGNTweets. And finally, for those joining on Zoom, please submit any questions you have throughout the discussion via the Q&A function. I'm keen to include as many as possible. We're mindful and respectful of the fact that we're hosting this event during a period of national mourning. However, it is through the lens of change and continuity that I want to approach our theme for today's discussion. Liz Truss was the candidate of change during the Conservative leadership election, but how much will the continuity of double-digit inflation causing the fastest fall in real incomes on record and huge fiscal and economic uncertainty check the new Prime Minister's ambition to break with so-called Treasury orthodoxy? Indeed, how much does her approach at pricing growth actually break with past orthodoxy? And most importantly for this discussion, how much continuity or change will we see in relation to Levelling Up, the flagship policy programme responsible for a large part of the Conservative Party's election-winning mandate in 2019, a mandate upon which Liz Truss's position as PM still, in theory at least, relies. So, my first question to Andy is, do you think Liz Truss's approach to stimulating growth, any growth through tax cuts, is compatible with continuing the Levelling Up agenda? How confident are you that that growth will benefit all communities across the regions and nations of the UK?
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you for that introduction, and afternoon, everyone. Going to be chatting about these signature economic challenges. For me, I mean, it's early days, isn't it, for the new government, and we are yet to see the detail of quite what is planned, both on the broader growth agenda and indeed levelling up. At least to my way of thinking, Charlotte, there absolutely is no inconsistency between that agenda of stimulating, which we all want and we all indeed sorely need, and levelling up. In fact, to the contrary, I think that when it comes to a national growth strategy for the UK, we have one already under our noses, hiding in plain sight, and that indeed is the essence of levelling up. At heart, that was in part about a question of social justice, which is to say rebalancing the scales in a way that closed deep and entrenched spatial disparities between different parts of the UK. It wasn't just about a question of social justice. It wasn't just about a question of distribution of the spoils. To some very significant degree, it was about questions of unlocking potential in people and in places, and therefore about the size of the pie, expanding it every bit as much as the distribution of that pie. In fact, in the Levelling Up white paper, Charlotte, remember, about page 67, we even put some numbers to the question of how much larger the pie might be if potential was unlocked in people and in places. So my answer, perhaps I would self-serving answer to the question, what should be the national economic growth plan that we all crave, is that we have it. It's there. It's a national growth plan built from the bottom up. If my numbers were even approximately right, it would deliver a significant helping of new growth on a sustainable basis, because the essence of unlocking potential is that is boosting the supply side of the economy in a way that actually mitigates that cost of living crisis that you mentioned, Charlotte, and secures a sort of medium-term sustainable growth that this country needs. So for me, these aren't choices, these aren't trade-offs. These are one and the same. We have a growth strategy. It is about levelling up. And the question now is how best we lean into that.
Well, we certainly agree with that at CPP. We talk about inclusive growth, which is a very similar, if not verging on interchangeable idea with levelling up. We think that those same supply side policies that you talk about, investing in skills, innovation and education, early years, perhaps we can get into a little bit about those particular measures, lead to a different type of growth where more and more people are able to contribute to the economy and benefit from that in return. It's a way of thinking about redistribution without harking back to old types of income transfers, essentially. Although that might be part of the picture, particularly in the short term when we're thinking about tackling the cost of living crisis. But we've heard very little from the new Prime Minister. We had very little on those supply side issues during the leadership campaign, which was potentially narrow for a reason. But how do we start to open up some of these conversations to get them back in that national and local debate about what central government should be doing, about how national government can alleviate this cost of living crisis, and kind of putting this approach to growth back front and center to the way that we are talking about that growth agenda, rather than one which has been so heavily dominated by the idea of tax cuts, which might have an effect, but I think they're going to be marginal in comparison to the supply side measures that you talked about.
Well, I think in confronting the challenges that we face economically, indeed socially as well, both short and medium term, the key, Charlotte, is going to be that we make use of all of the policy tools at our disposal. That means the ones that get lots of discussion in the media, such as monetary policy and fiscal policy. But even more importantly, it means making use of the third arm of policy, much less discussed in the media and beyond, which is structural policy or supply side policy. Because right now, monetary policy, unlike back at the time of the global financial crisis, has a somewhat more circumscribed role to play. Its role is essentially to do no harm, to try and keep the inflation cat in the bag, while at the same time supporting the economy where you can. The role of fiscal policy is, as ever, to help smooth over the bumps. And the economy in the UK economies globally are facing a very significant downwards bump in the road right now from the cost of living crisis. So it's only right and proper that fiscal policy plays its role in smoothing out that bump. You've seen the announcements from the government here to go in that direction. But ultimately, the root cause of this cost of living crisis, which has created such dilemmas for both monetary and fiscal policy, is a set of supply side fractures or fissures or fault lines of long standing. The kind of proximate cause near term, of course, is the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but sitting beneath that are some deep lying, long lasting fault lines in energy supply. And what's true of energy supply is true of the supply of a whole range of goods and services. That's why the prices of a wide range of goods and services are going up right now. That's why the inflation is generalized, not specific to any one sector. And of course, what is true of pretty much any and every good and service, is also true of the supply of that precious commodity called people. We are chronically short of people and the skills of people in this country right now, which is one of the reasons why wages are going up alongside prices, and one reason I think why this cost of living crisis, even if the Russia-Ukraine crisis war to abate, will persist for quite some while. It has legs because it's based on a broadly based set of supply side fractures, fissures, and fault lines, lots of F's in there. And to tackle those problems at source, that speaks to structural or supply side policies. They are the only route to redemption in tackling the cost of living crisis sustainably, and they are the route to redemption when it comes to paying down the debt that we're accumulating to smooth out bumps. And they are the route to redemption when it comes to growing our economy on a sustainable basis to boost our living standards and all the good things that flow from that. So the third arm of policy is an arm that's discussed far too little, and ultimately is the route to policy acceleration.
And is it perhaps discussed too little because a lot of these things take a long time to filter through into the real economy, whether that's training people or whether that's thinking about, say, the long-term benefits derived from effective early intervention or early years policy. We've seen, I think, during the pandemic, the impact that ill health can have directly on our economy, and we're seeing that now with levels of economic inactivity rising. And one of my sort of pet subjects is that we also saw, when the childcare system breaks down and employers wonder why their staff can't go to work, we undervalue some of these structural public services or structural forms of intervention at our cost. But they take a long time to filter through, and Liz Truss in particular is going to be looking for some quick wins. Firstly, because the crisis is here and now, and politicians are under pressure more than ever through social media, but there is an immediate reality of 9.9% inflation. And the fact that she's got to win an election, or she'll want to win an election in 18 months or so time. The ambition of those 12 missions that you set out in the Levelling Up white paper, with the time horizon of 2030, even with the best will in the world, we're going to be difficult for a stable government that could solely focus on those things to achieve. How do we reconcile these tensions of short, the longer term, the quick wins, and the things that are going to take that time by nature to filter through?
Yeah, great question, Charlotte. I'll not give a full answer to it, of course. First point, you mentioned those missions underpinning Levelling Up. Those missions spoke to that many and various set of, broadly speaking, supply side fault lines I mentioned earlier on. So the two things were kind of coterminous, and that's the sense in which the Levelling Up white paper was a plan for national growth, as well as being a plan for levelling up. Those missions were medium term in their orientation. That's rightful recognition. The supply side problems take time to fix, especially when those fault lines have been many decades in the making. They've opened up progressively over a period of 50 to 70 years. It'd be fanciful to think they could be closed overnight, or even in a time span measured in years rather than decades. However, that does not mean a start could not and should not be made now. It's back to the old point about when's the best time to have planted a tree. Well, the best time is about 30 years ago, but the second best time, and we didn't do it then, is today. So of course we should start today in making progress. And what's more, I think we would see the rewards of starting to make progress today. What people want above all else, when you travel around the country, they know that these problems cannot be magicked away overnight. They know this will be a long haul. They're not expecting to be leveled up to, I don't know, London levels of pay and productivity overnight. What matters when it comes to people's perceptions is the direction of travel, the sense that they are moving forward rather than being left further behind. If people have some tangible sense of making progress, that can really shift their expectations, their perceptions, the stories they tell about their place. They're then on a journey that's moving forwards and upwards rather than looking backwards and downwards. I used to travel around the country, which I used to do a lot, to visit places. I didn't have to look at the numbers, and I did. I didn't have to. So you could figure out pretty quickly how well or how badly a place was doing by speaking to local people about what was going on. And the places that were not doing so well, the stories they told were stories that looked backwards and downwards. It was why this hadn't worked or that had disappeared. And the places that were doing well, the stories they told looked forwards and upwards, had a new narrative about their place, and that was an uplifting narrative. That made all the difference. Because if you're looking forwards and upwards, that gives you the go forward to invest in yourself, in your place, and that then becomes self-fulfilling. And what is true at the local level is true at the national level. Even though supply side change takes time to bear fruit, the traveling matters every bit as much as the destination. And your sense of being on a journey, a positive journey, is the thing that raises your spirits, raises your expectations, causes you to invest, and therefore bears fruit both in the short and in the medium term. So, my lesson would be, although the clock is ticking, the best time to start addressing those issues is now, and there'll be some short-term payoff from doing so, even though the journey is a long one.
That's great, thank you. An inspiring message to new policy makers in the new cabinet. But just reflecting a little bit on some of the things that happened in the previous administration, because it too was thinking about what kind of quick wins could it enact that signalled that journey that the government wanted to take places on. And one of the aspects of that I have written a little bit about and have not always been supremely supportive of, shall we say, is that kind of do up your high streets approach, make people feel good with the hanging baskets or whatever cladding it might be around vacant shops or elsewhere, and that being enough to signal that a place was really going to benefit from genuine economic opportunity. The kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of structural supply side measures, town centre regeneration is part of a story that allows you to look forwards and up, as you say, but reskilling people and for people to feel that they themselves can access and participate in those economic opportunities, where I think levelling up at its best gets us to. What would you say is an example of a kind of do now policy that gets people on that journey but doesn't feel as superficial as perhaps the hanging baskets approach?
Yeah. Well, let me speak a bit to that. And you asked about quick wins, so let me offer a few. I'm not sure whether they're quick, but there's certainly areas where progress could be made, and in some cases where progress is being made relatively expeditiously. And the first one I'll mention actually is around devolution, because it's not true to say that little to nothing has happened on all matters levelling up since the white paper was published back in March, April. Actually, quite a lot of progress has been made when it comes to progressing the course of devolution in places around the UK. We've seen some examples of that already with announcements, for example, about BRT in York and North Yorkshire. but it's true of the so-called devolution trailblazer deals in Greater Manchester and West Midlands, which have been going through the years, and the same has been true in other places across the UK. We'll see more coming on stream on that front in the months ahead, I think. So there's a place, not just where progress could be made, but where progress has been made over the past few months, and that's about that costs relatively little. It's not a big, not burning big holes in the wallet to devolve powers. I think, for me, that is an absolute essential prerequisite, both of levelling up and indeed of wider growth. That more local agency is a cornerstone of that, and progress can and has, I think, been made on that front. Mention a second area where I think progress could be made in fairly short order, that again wouldn't involve the government having to dig deep at a time where it's already digging deep, and that's when it comes to mobilising pools of patient capital in the private sector, and having them help support the regeneration process in places. There is a £300 billion pool of local government pension fund assets out there, relatively little of which currently is put to work in place to support places in the regen, with a tilt and a coaxing and cajoling. Those monies could be put to work purposefully in help to support regeneration, and I hope that they are. We had things that spoke in that direction in the Lovely White Paper that I hope can be made good on. Your final point there, Charlotte, about hanging baskets. Here's the way I think about that, which is, point one is that let's not underestimate the importance of what you might call social infrastructure in supporting placemaking. Hanging baskets are giving a slight, metaphor for trying to do things up on the cheap. But for me, they would form part, only a small part, but a part of what might more broadly be called social infrastructure, by which I mean decent high streets, green spaces, museums, youth clubs, football clubs, and the like. The sort of things that make places worth living in is you can create all the jobs that you like, all the businesses that you like, all the infrastructure, physical and digital, that you like. If there's nothing to do in a place after 6 o'clock in the evening, people aren't going to want to live there, right? If it feels unsafe or unattractive to walk down the high street, there's no way to go for a walk. There's nothing for young people to do of an evening. That is a key missing ingredient in placemaking and is a recipe for failure, not success. I wouldn't want to underestimate the importance. I think we have structurally underestimated the importance of social infrastructure in placemaking. It's not just about all the nerdy stuff that economists like me bang on about, like skills and machines, and physical infrastructure. That social infrastructure matters every bit as much to placemaking, because it matters every bit as much, if not more, to people's sense of well-being and wanting to live in a place. So that'll be point one. Well, is that even if it's necessary, though, is it sufficient? Well, clearly it's not sufficient. The hanging baskets will not be sufficient if there aren't any businesses, there aren't any jobs, there aren't any trains, there aren't any buses. So it's one ingredient in many, but equally, you've heard me use this metaphor before. The recipe for local growth, the recipe for national growth, is like a cake mix. And the most important ingredient in any cake is, of course, the one that's missing. And if the one that's missing is social infrastructure, then that's the most important one. In many of the places we're talking about, it's not the only missing ingredient. They're missing the skills and the jobs and the infrastructure too, in which case the recipe involves making good on all the missing ingredients. So when it comes to that, important, yes, but not in of itself, not as an alternative to these other important things. Very much to complement to that.
Brilliant, thank you. You know, I have spent a long time banging on about the importance of social infrastructure and the whole premise of inclusive growth as we set out back when I worked at the RSA and ran the Inclusive Growth Commission that was chaired by Stephanie Flanders. You know, we talked about investing in social infrastructure as much as and alongside physical infrastructure. So, you know, you find me, I hope, a kind of one of the outriders in putting forward that argument. I guess just to sort of defend my own position a little bit, not that I need to, but I think I would sort of put the hanging baskets in a category where it was less about, yes, about quality of life and quality of place and placemaking as you talk about, but I think it felt to me that government often feels like it can use that as a cover for not investing in health, in education, in early years, in youth services, in wider community services that we know since 2010, have really seen a decline in their funding. And I think it's those forms of social infrastructure that have taken a hit and have hollowed out communities and mean that those communities who might already be looking down and, you know, behind them, continue to do so all the more, and with the current cost of living crisis are going to be struggling out of that situation. So social infrastructure, yes, but I think we need to really keep pressing and hold government to account for the nature of that, the quantum of that, and the way that it's invested as a system in a local place, which I was so thrilled to hear you talk about devolution and place. And I know you are a great campaigner of that too. And of course, our Inclusive Growth Network members are just some of those pioneers. You mentioned West Mids and Greater Manchester. I know we've got people on the call from North of Tyne as well, similarly, and I want to bring their questions in in a moment. But Marvin Rees, Mayor of Bristol, another one of our IGN members, said that central government acts as if local government doesn't exist. So, you know, you and me and others can talk about devolution, and we do talk about devolution, but the national conversation is not there. And at this point of crisis, we think that much more can be done by local leaders to step up and support their communities. Do you think that this new government is creating enough space to really allow that part of the growth strategy of levelling up to really flourish?
I think in my conversations with local leaders right around the UK, I've actually been rather reassuring, I should say, over the past few months. I mean, the situation is obviously very difficult for all the reasons you set out, for all the reasons we all know. Budgets are incredibly tight and probably tightening. But from local leaders, I had a strong sense of them getting on with it, to be honest. I think we've gone through an extended period now of repeated shocks and almost continuous uncertainty, stretching certainly well back to at least the global financial crisis. The shocks have come thick and fast. The fog of uncertainty has rarely, if ever, lifted. If anything, it's kind of compounded itself over time. I think for a bit, even for a relatively lengthy period, people were slightly paralyzed by the uncertainty and said, look, let's sit tight in the choices we make and the investments we make, and hope that the fog lifts, the uncertainty dissipates, and that will give us a clearer road ahead, and then we'll start driving at some pace. I think, 14, 15 years on, it's still as foggy now as it probably was back then. There's no obvious sign of that fog lifting anytime soon, whether that's political uncertainty or economic uncertainties in its many and various forms. I think lots of local leaders, and I think a good many businesses as well, are saying, well, rather than waiting for the fog to lift, and rather than waiting for government to tell us what we can and can't do, we should crack on. I have a strong sense that lots of people local leaders in particular, are just cracking on. The budget is tight, but that's not a reason for inactivity, and many of the best are simply cracking on with their plans. And rather than asking central government, to tell central government what is needed to lift the fortunes of their place, and therefore to drive growth in their place. And that's the sense in which this bottom-up to delivering national growth is, for me, exactly the right one. I think if enough places in enough parts of the UK crack on, make those investments, lay those plans. I don't actually mean local government, by the way. I mean businesses locally as well, and community and civil society organisations as well. That's where leadership comes from. If enough of them make good on their plans, with government, central government playing a helping hand, you will get local growth in enough places that will drive the national growth and make good on central government's objectives. That, for me, should be the playbook.
And that's a really neat segue, because I want to spend the next just shy of 10 minutes coming to some questions, particularly from local places, many of whom are from the IGN on the call today. One from Caroline Preston from North of Tyne. She asked, given all the economic problems we're facing, how important does the government view initiatives that promote the need for businesses to provide good work? So there's good work agenda, and somebody else asked about good work charters as well previously. There's a question around the role of the low carbon sector from Martin. He mentions places like Hull who have really capitalised on offshore wind. How might we be able to support that? And then Jay Murphy has asked, in the interest of levelling up, which policies or programmes should not be devolved to local authorities? So maybe a little bit more on the place theme there.
Very good. Well, picking those off, and I may not have got them all, Charlotte, you may need to help me out. I couldn't scribble fast enough. On Caroline's question, which is about good work, I mean, absolutely existential to a well-functioning economy, whether locally or nationally. In fact, when I'm asked for my definition of what Lovely Imp is really about, a single sentence, I tend to say good work at a good wage everywhere, basically. That's certainly a necessary condition, not necessarily a sufficient one for success. So absolutely that needs to be the case. And of course, the good wage is as important as the good work if people are to have a good life. And we did manage in the Lovely and White Paper, which I eventually stopped banging on about, did include as a success criteria well-being, which I viewed personally as something of a success, that we had that front and center in judging whether we were levelling up or not. It's not just about productivity and pay and living standards and GDP. It's also about people's wider sense of well-being from that. So yes, that has to be a central pillar of all of this, and that will be challenging. That'll be challenging because if we are going to have a downward step in the economy, as most forecasters are anticipating, and that'll be on that front, then the currently very low levels of unemployment might be challenged. We might find a very large pool of vacancies being absorbed. So that's very much important to have that front and center, the wage as well as the work. Martin's question was around Hull and net zero and the opportunities, I think, for that flows. I think they are very, very considerable. This is back to unlocking potential in places. I think there's huge amounts of potential to be unlocked, not just in and around Hull when it comes to offshore wind in particular and renewables, but actually right up that northern coast stretching from the Wash to the borders, with the new EV plant in Sunderland, Brickvolt, Blythe, all the fantastic stuff around Teesport, down to Hull and Humber, and its offshore wind plans. I think, with hindsight, kind of mea culpa, would have said more about this actually in the white paper. There is a sort of divine coincidence in some ways between those places most in need of levelling up and those places that need to undergo the sharpest transition towards net zero. And there is a clean green industrial strategy for all sorts of places around the UK that make good on both of those things in short order. They are made good on in short order. I think the final question, I managed to not write down who asked it, for which I can only apologise. I think that was about other places where we shouldn't be devolving.
I think are there functions rather than are there places to it?
Yeah, and the answer to that must be yeah. And there are a whole bunch of things that are better provided centrally and nationally than they are locally. But let's be clear: the place we start is like 1,000,000 miles away from that, right? So relative to almost all other, certainly advanced Western economies, we start with the most centralized by a margin. That's still true when it comes to devo of spending powers, but it's true to an even greater extent when it comes to devo of taxation powers. So I wouldn't want to run to the side of the boat and give everything locally. That would be too far, too fast. But let's be clear, we could travel a very considerable distance at a very considerable pace and still be miles away from where most of the rest of the world is, and that's the path.
Great, thank you. And I'll just take a couple more questions. So we had a few questions around investing in science and innovation across the UK. Do you think that the emphasis that we saw, which was considerable under the previous government with Dominic Cummings, his drive to double R&D spend, do you think that that's going to be overlooked either by the crisis or by other priorities for levelling up? Another question from Isabel Fry. She's from the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Would a universal basic income grant be the best way forward? I know that's something the RSA have looked a lot about in the past. And I guess a final question from me is coming back to where we started around this idea of being unorthodox. Is there a kind of unorthodox, radical, different way of thinking about policy that you would urge this government to take on, either in its emergency budget next week or throughout the course of the remainder of this Parliament?
Very good. They're all whopper questions. I haven't got whopper amounts of time, so I'll have to be terse on all three, I think, Charlotte, so we don't bust our time schedule too much. But to those three, the first one around science and R&D, we don't know a lot about the payoff from those investments, and they are high, and they stretch out into the medium term, and they deliver just the sort of supply side improvement and sustainable growth that we know is so important, so desirous right now. So it would be penny wise, but very much pound foolish, I think, to cut back on the ambitions around, broadly speaking, R&D or investment spend right now, because we know that delivers returns. Those returns ought to be harvested right across the UK. Disproportionate skew of R&D spend towards the southeast, towards the Golden Triangle, historically, the levelling up white paper, signaled a retilting of that. And of course, there are the pockets of scientific and innovative brilliance right across the UK we should be leaning into, with both our public and private spend on R&D. 2.5% of GDP by 2027 is still the government's goal. If anything, that is erring on the under-ambitious, given what other countries are doing right now. So this is a time to be north of that rather than south of that. That would be my advice, given my diagnosis on what's happening economically. So that was question one. Remind me of question two. I've written something down and can't read it.
UBI.
That was question two. Sorry, I did write it down correctly. Yeah, I mean, in a way, you know, some of the fiscal support packages we've seen of late, including the most recent one, I don't just mean for cost of living, but prior to that furlough, were in some ways in the spirit of underpinning the incomes of a great many people and providing support targeted to a greater or lesser extent on the most vulnerable. So very much in the spirit, if not in the letter, of UBI, when needs must. When needs must. When it comes to the UBI question in normal times, as distinct from abnormal times, I mean, I know I'm familiar with the debate that is ongoing. You're right, the RSA has been part of that debate. What it's worth, personally, I am on the skeptical side of neutral of that debate when it comes to both feasibility. Could it be large enough to make a real difference in a way that's affordable? And prospectively, in terms of the virtue of good work in and of itself. But I consider myself, I hope, malleable and open-minded on these things. So when people come forward with sufficiently persuasive arguments, I'm quite happily to hear them and perhaps even to be persuaded on them. And then the final question was on an orthodoxy. I slightly jib at that word, to be honest, because various stages throughout my career, I've already been called an orthodox or heterodox, or certainly not necessarily with the mainstream. I always think, and history suggests this broadly to be true, that today's heterodoxy is tomorrow's orthodoxy. So in that sense, who's to know what orthodox actually is? I think in my case, whether it's heterodox or orthodox, my diagnosis, Charlotte, for what's needed is the one that we've spoken about a bit today. I think now is a time for real boldness in thinking. We've gone through now, I mentioned that the last 15 years, really bumpy ride. Shocks have come thick and fast. Global shocks have come thick and fast. The defining feature of those global shocks, however, is that UK PLC is often copped disproportionately for them. You can argue, has that just been a case of bad luck? I would argue it hasn't been a case of pure bad luck. It's because those shocks have bumped up against an economy that's lacked resilience. Its immune system is not as it should be, and put into economist speak rather than physiological speak. That's down to the structural fractures, fissures, and fault lines that I mentioned earlier on. The only reason we will strengthen our immune system is by addressing those supply side problems, and that will mean when the next nasty is upon us, and of course, is a question of when rather than whether, we'll not be hit disproportionately by it. We'll not be asking ourselves, why is it always us? We'll be more robust, more resilient. Growth will be stronger. And if that's, I'm not sure, as I say, whether that's heterodoxy or orthodoxy, but for me, it's the right prescription just right now.
Fantastic. What a way to finish. Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you so much for listening, everyone, for your questions. And Andy has kindly signed up to speak at our Inclusive Growth Annual Conference, which is on the 22nd of November. So do look out for an invitation from us to join him and an array of similarly illustrious speakers on that event. And we look forward to seeing you there then and engaging on our work on inclusive growth, levelling up as we tackle these difficult times together. Many thanks again.